When my Uncle Charles died, I didn't exactly feel sadness. I hadn't seen him in years, ever since my family distanced themselves from him. He was a strange, reserved man, always carrying a distant look, as if he were somewhere else, even when physically present. My mother rarely spoke about him, only mentioning that after my aunt passed away, he became even more reclusive, refusing visits, phone calls, and any kind of contact. The news of his death came through an unexpected call from a lawyer. My uncle had left his property to me, a grand old Victorian house on the outskirts of town, far enough that the neighborhood was practically non-existent. I must admit that my first reaction wasn't grief or surprise, but rather a strange discomfort, as if something about it all was inherently wrong. I wasn't particularly interested in the house, but I accepted the inheritance, thinking I could sell it after assessing its condition. When I finally arrived at the property, I understood why Charles had withdrawn from everyone. The house was a looming presence, imposing, with its aged structure and tall windows that seemed to watch me as I approached. The garden was overgrown with weeds. The barren trees cast twisted silhouettes against the gray sky, and the wind whispered something inaudible through the dry leaves scattered across the ground. Upon opening the front door, I was met with an almost oppressive silence. The air carried the scent of old wood and dust, mixed with something subtler, an indefinable smell that caused a vague discomfort. The furniture was draped in yellowed sheets, and each step I took sent small clouds of dust rising from the wooden floor. Yet the house didn't feel entirely abandoned. There were signs that someone had still been living there until recently. A forgotten teacup on the living room table, a wristwatch beside an open book in the library. Small details that gave the eerie impression that Charles could walk through the door at any moment. I climbed the creaking stairs, exploring the rooms one by one. My uncle's bedroom was simple and disorganized, with papers scattered across the desk and wrinkled clothes tossed onto the bed. In the bathroom, his toothbrush still rested on the sink, as if waiting to be used again. It was strange, unsettling, as though he had vanished suddenly, rather than simply passed away. In the following days, I began cataloging the house's belongings, deciding what could be sold or discarded. It was during this process that I started noticing peculiarities. The blueprints I found in a drawer indicated the house had a total of 12 rooms. Yet as I walked through it, I counted 13. There was an extra room. At first, I thought it was a mistake in the records, a common oversight in old houses that had been remodeled over the years. But the unsettling feeling persisted, a subtle unease that made me question whether I should even be there. The extra room was located at the end of the second-floor hallway, a simple wooden door, dark and unremarkable. I was certain I had never seen that door before. I spent the following days immersed in confused memories, trying to connect with the house and its past. Although I didn't have many recollections of my childhood there, some details surfaced in disjointed flashes. I remembered a visit I made with my parents when I was very young. My uncle at that time still seemed like an ordinary man, though he always carried an air of constant worry. I recalled him guiding my mother through the house while I played alone in the second-floor hallway. One particular memory unsettled me. I saw myself standing in front of a smooth wall where now there was a door. I decided to search for answers among my uncle's belongings. I combed through the office, the library, the wooden trunks in the attic, anything that could give me clues about the house's past. That was when I found a box of old photographs hidden in the back of a dusty wardrobe. As I flipped through the images, I noticed they all had one thing in common. The house's architecture remained unchanged, from my grandparents' time to the present day. However, there were no records of the extra room. The second-floor hallway had always ended in a solid wall with no door. My heart pounded. I closed the box and climbed the stairs. There it was, the door that shouldn't exist. My body hesitated. My mind tried to rationalize, but something deeper, more instinctual, pushed me forward. I slowly turned the handle, and to my surprise, the door opened without resistance. The air inside the room was thick, heavy, as if it had been sealed for decades. The dim light from the hallway revealed a small room, its furniture covered in old sheets and a fine layer of dust on every surface. I stepped inside, feeling a chill run down my spine. The room had a strange smell, a mix of damp wood and something metallic, rusted. There was a desk in the corner, and beside it an armchair pressed against the wall. Above the desk, a shelf held old books and dust-covered notebooks. In the center of the room, a tall, oval mirror reflected my figure in a distorted way. The feeling of being watched intensified. I approached the desk and opened the top drawer. Inside, I found a stack of letters, yellowed with age. They were addressed to my uncle, but signed by an unfamiliar name. The handwriting was shaky, some sentences violently crossed out, but the content of the letters was unsettling. They spoke of recurring nightmares, whispering voices, and the sensation that something was trying to emerge from within the walls of the house. I carefully turned the letters over, feeling the thin paper almost disintegrating between my fingers. Some were stained, as if drops of ink or something darker had been spilled on them. As I read, a disturbing narrative unfolded. The writer seemed to be begging my uncle to abandon the house, warning about invisible presences and echoes of something ancient. Each letter contained fragments of a deeper mystery. Some described strange events that occurred at night, doors locking on their own, whispers rising from the walls, and shadows shifting when no one was looking. The sender, whose name was never clearly signed, mentioned that the house held secrets that should never be uncovered. As I continued reading, one sentence caught my attention. The symbols are not for protection, but for containment. If they fail, you will be the last to bear the burden. My hands trembled. I looked around, observing the walls of the room more carefully. That was when I noticed, beneath the layer of dust and fading, small symbols were carved into the wood, almost imperceptible. They looked like ancient engravings, made with obsessive precision. Setting the letters aside, I began inspecting the furniture. The desk had smaller locked drawers. After a few minutes of forcing one open, I finally managed to pry it open. Inside, there was a worn leather notebook, its pages filled with drawings and notes that made no immediate sense. Overlapping triangles, pupilless eyes, diagrams that seemed to depict human bodies intersected by lines and circles. Some pages were written in a language I didn't recognize, but among the scribbles, one word appeared repeatedly: transition. There was also a bundle wrapped in red cloth. As I untied it, I found a tarnished silver medallion, engraved with a symbol resembling a fragmented spiral. The moment I touched it, a faint vibration ran through my fingers. A chill crept up my spine. Did my uncle believe in this? Or had he simply been consumed by an obsession that drove him mad? I kept exploring the room, my mind racing with questions. Opening another drawer, I found a stack of loose sheets filled with scribbled notes and faded ink. Some read like journal entries, others like transcripts of conversations or scattered thoughts. The voice is clearer tonight. One page read, "It calls me by name now." Another contained an even more unsettling note. "I must not forget the ritual. I must not break the cycle. The house requires balance." My eyes were drawn to a large sheet of paper, folded multiple times. Unfolding it, I realized it was a floor plan of the house, covered in markings and modifications. Lines traced paths that made no sense, and on the second floor, right where I now stood, one detail caught my attention. The room was marked in dark ink with a note beside it that read, "Door open. It was never supposed to be here." My heart pounded. I turned back to the mirror at the center of the room, feeling a weight pressing against my chest. My reflection seemed darker, the shadows in the room deeper than they should have been. Then a thought settled into my mind like a persistent whisper. I was not alone here, and maybe I never had been, from the moment I entered this house. Swallowing hard, I kept searching. Behind the desk, I found a small wooden box, locked shut. I grabbed one of the rusty hooks from inside the drawer and forced the lock until it snapped open with a dry crack. Inside, there was a bundle of black and white photographs. Some showed my uncle as a younger man, in different stages of his life. In many of them, he was not alone. Figures dressed in dark robes stood beside him, gathered in a stone-walled hall, illuminated only by candlelight. In some photos, strange symbols could be seen on the ground around them. There was also one last photograph, set apart from the others. It showed an elderly man with a rigid expression, seated in an armchair beside a table filled with books. Behind him, a wall covered in shelves, and there, in the far background, a mirror reflecting something that shouldn't have been there. Not the man, nor the furniture in the room, but a vague, dark silhouette lurking in the shadows. My breathing grew heavy. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady myself, but then I heard it. A low sound, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere inside the room, like a whisper I couldn't yet make out. Slowly, I turned my head toward the mirror and felt my blood run cold. My reflection was still there, but something behind me seemed to be moving. The pieces began to fall into place in a terrible, inevitable pattern. What had once seemed like meaningless scribbles, inexplicable drawings, and disjointed phrases now formed a clear and cruel design. My uncle wasn't just a scholar of the occult. He was deeply involved in practices that went far beyond mere academic curiosity. I spent hours analyzing the scattered notes throughout the room. Among the pages of the leather-bound notebook I had found earlier, there were passages describing complex rituals. Some mentioned the need for a blood link for a successful transition. Others spoke of how a recently abandoned body could serve as an ideal vessel if the preparation was done correctly. With every new word I read, the air around me seemed heavier. The letters I had found in the desk now took on a new meaning. At first, I thought they were written by a friend trying to steer my uncle away from some growing paranoia, but now I understood the truth. They weren't warnings. They were records of a carefully orchestrated process. The sender, whoever they were, knew exactly what Charles was trying to do. "The time is near," one of the last letters read. "The vessel is already inside the house. The final preparation must be completed before the night of transition." I was the vessel, my stomach twisted. The walls of the room seemed to close in around me. My own uncle, he hadn't called me here out of nostalgia or to leave me something valuable. He had lured me in like a hunter lures prey, with patience and precision. Everything had been meticulously planned. The inheritance, the letters, the house. All of it was part of a ritual decades in the making. The notes detailed the ritual of reincarnation. It was a long and cruel process requiring meticulous preparation. The essence of the executor would bind to the blood, ensuring that the spirit would not dissipate at the moment of death. The new body, still young, would serve as the perfect vessel for the soul to gradually migrate, replacing the host's mind until only the consciousness of the former occupant remained. The physical transformation would happen gradually, at first in subtle ways. Slightly altered features, changes in voice, distinct food preferences, until the body itself reshaped to match the original. By the time the transition was complete, the new vessel would never suspect that it had once been someone else. It was then that I noticed something strange in my reflection in the desk mirror. My eyes seemed different. The shape, the color, something in them had changed in an almost imperceptible way, but in a disturbingly familiar manner. I approached the mirror and touched my face. My skin felt rougher, the contours of my jaw more pronounced. My fingers trembled as the realization hit me. The transition had already begun. The memories began to change as well. Small lapses at first. I would enter a room and forget why I was there. Then came the subtle details, memories that didn't belong to me. I remembered walking through the hallways of this house when I was young, but not as a visitor. I remembered being here as though I had always lived here. I remembered studying those esoteric books, writing some of the notes I had once considered unfamiliar. I remembered being Charles. I tried to focus on what was real. I closed my eyes and tried to recall my childhood, my life before I arrived here. But the memories were fragmented, slipping away like smoke. The names of my parents sounded distant. My childhood seemed like a faded dream. In contrast, vivid memories took their place. Sleepless nights scribbling symbols on scrolls, experiments to strengthen the spiritual connection, the whispering voices that guided me. The transformation was not just physical. My very self was disappearing. Charles's plan was working, and I was powerless to stop it. I began to search through the furniture with growing desperation, looking for anything that might give me more information. That's when I found an envelope hidden at the back of a secret drawer. Inside, a single piece of paper with careful handwriting. The cycle continues. The blood must return to the flesh. The one who inherited will return it. Thus it has always been. Thus it always will be. Looking around, I realized the symbols carved into the walls weren't mere protective charms. They weren't there to ward off some malevolent presence. They were there to imprison something within the house or within me. I tried to remember the times I visited my uncle when I was a child. I always thought he was just a reclusive man, perhaps eccentric. But as I recalled the details, I realized something strange. There was always a heavy air around him, a distant look in his eyes as if he were waiting for something. And I, naive, would run through those hallways, playing and exploring, never noticing the long looks he gave me. My fingers trembled as I touched my own face once again. I was never exactly a good boy at my uncle's house, but I didn't know he hated me so much.